So as we're looking at 2021, I'm talking with investors that are kind of two minds. So people that have cash sitting on the sidelines, they're wondering whether or not they should invest. And they're either thinking, holy cow, 2020 was too much to handle. The market's too volatile right now. I don't think it's the right time to put my cash into the market. Or they're looking at things saying, the market's done so well over the last couple months that I'm afraid if I invest right now, I'm going to be putting my money in at a high point and then a correction is going to come. And that may not have been the right decision. It's more about the purpose for the money and when you're going to need it. So if it's a shorter term need, then it may not be the best idea to invest it right now. If it's something you're not going to need for a while, then maybe there are ways that you could consider investing.
You talk about how having a good cash reserve is important. To you, what does that mean?
Generally speaking, it is normally a good idea to keep somewhere between 3 and 6 months of expenses in a cash reserve, kind of an emergency fund, if you will. Where you fall on that spectrum is really more individual. So all of this is individualized to kind of your needs. I can't give individual advice to the masses. But if you're, say, a physician, probably pretty low odds of getting laid off right now, right? You're in pretty high demand. So 3 months of emergency fund would probably be okay for a physician. Whereas if you're in an industry where you have a higher risk, especially as we're still in the midst of COVID, economically speaking, if there's a higher risk that you may get furloughed or laid off, you may be wanting to have more like 6 months of expenses in a cash reserve, just so you could give yourself time, cover your expenses to find a new job if something were to happen, and then be able to cover kind of unexpected expenses that would come up along the way.
If you're someone who volatility makes you nervous, what should you be looking at within your own portfolio?
And so a lot of people assume that when they invest, they're putting all their money into stocks. And that's not necessarily true. There are options to put your money in stocks. There are also ways to make your portfolio a little bit more moderate. So you could add some bond exposure to your portfolio. Bonds, generally speaking, don't make as much as stocks do, but they also usually don't lose as much as stocks do. So if you add some bond exposure to your portfolio during a time of volatility, if you are someone who's nervous, that can give you a little bit more moderate exposure to kind of weather the volatility that's to come. A lot of times younger investors think that they should be more aggressive. I don't think there's necessarily a should to it. I think it's more dependent on your comfort level. So I've worked with younger investors who are actually surprised to find that they can take a more moderate approach. They can still get enough return over a long period of time to reach their financial goals, and they don't experience such large degrees of up and downs along the way.
There's a camp of people who understand investing, and then there's a camp of people who just don't. It just doesn't make sense. Is that sort of where diversifying falls into play here? Are there things that those young, inexperienced people should be looking at in 2021?
Yeah, I think that point about further diversification is a great one. So if you buy, say, one stock, then your entire investment fortune is tied up in how that one company performs. Right? So most of the time, if you're going to go buy something like a mutual fund is just hundreds of stocks. So you've added some diversification. That's just a fancy word for more stuff to your portfolio, which means you have less of a chance that every single one of those companies is going to determine your portfolio's performance, because they're not all going to do the same thing at the same time. Again, generally speaking. And then beyond that, a lot of people will buy, say, a fund that is an S&P 500 fund or a US large company fund. Well, that still is just giving you exposure to US large companies. There are things like international large companies. There are US small companies, international small companies, US value companies, international value companies. All of these sound fancy. They're just different types of companies. So the more types of companies, and generally speaking, the more companies you can put into your portfolio, and mutual funds make this pretty easy to do, you can get a very similar result in terms of return, but you don't have so much up and down along the way because your fortune, say, isn't tied up with how one company is doing or how one part of the market is doing.